Hey guys, Kirk here, and thank you for joining me on a new video on the channel. This video is going to be the second installment to my new series, Build Worlds V2. And in this video in particular, what I want to do for my new series, Build Worlds V2, is to create a new landscape, but we're going to enable world partition for this landscape as well. And I'm going to give you a good understanding of world partition and how it works. It's not as complicated as you would imagine, but world partition is very powerful and it's a really good tool, especially if working in teams and even working solo. It's a very good tool and does speed up the workflow that you assign to it. So it's very powerful. But yeah, like I said, we're going to create a landscape for our new series, and we're also going to be talking about world partition. Before we get started though, I'm going to come to Windows. I'd like you to follow along, guys, and go to World Partition and then World Partition Editor. As you can see, I've got my World Partition already open. Just have it open and set it up into your viewport how you would like it, and just have it ready. With the series that we're using, with the series we're doing, Build Worlds V2. In the previous video, we set up our project using the open world template. So if you're aiming to create a world and this is your first video to the series, I would highly recommend going to File, New Level, and doing an empty open world, or, well, yeah, I'd say empty open world, and then just come into Windows, Environment Light Mixer, and add in the various lights like your exponential height fog, directional light, sky atmosphere, skylight, and volumetric clouds. And then if you do that, you will be up to the same stage as we are in this series. But if you're watching this video for the first time and you've already got your project set up and things like that, because we've set this project up in a way with the template of open world, in the project settings, I come to project settings and then come to engine and then navigate down to world partition. You'll see I don't have a tick box for world partition. If you check your project settings and world partition, if you didn't set up your project to have world partition enabled, you may have a checkbox in here that you would have to check for world partition. You may not. Okay, that's that out the way. What else is there? Come to your world settings and then world partition and enable streaming. You would need to enable this, but I don't think this will appear until world partition is enabled in your project settings. For all honesty, guys, it's a lot easier and a lot better to just create a new level using the open world template. That's probably your best bet. Pardon me. Okay, so this beginning part where we're going to come into landscape mode, it's going to be aimed at more beginner to intermediate, as I'm going to go through the landscaping mode itself. Not all the sculpting tools or the paint tools, because that's coming in a future video, but just for beginners, I'm just going to go over the landscape mode in general and how it works. It is quite important because I am going to explain a bit about world partition in there as well. Okay, so I'm going, actually, before I get started, I want to get a bit organised here because it's been bugging me since the start of the video. So I'm going to click on my directional light, then come to volumetric clouds, hold left shift on the keyboard and click and highlight them all. Now you can come up to the top here and create a new folder containing the current selection, or you can right click, move to, and create a new folder. They're both the same thing, they do the same thing. So in here I'm going to call this environment lighting, like so. And now my environment lighting is all contained in its own little folder. One change I do want to make is come to the plus icon here and then go to visual effects, post process volume, and drag that in right there. And before I get moving, I'm just going to reset its location so it's in there with everything else. This post process volume is going to go into my environment lighting folder as well. The reason I've dragged this in early on is because I want to change the exposure. As you can see, all this exposure here, it's kind of doing my eyes in. So I'm going to come to exposure, highlight exposure compensation and the minimum and maximum evolution. And the exposure compensation I'm going to set to 0. And then both the min and max evolution I'm going to set to 1. And you can see nothing has changed. So why have I done that? The reason I've done it is to sort the exposure out, but I have not set my post-process to infinite extent, which essentially, once you tick this, means this post-process volume in particular is going to affect the whole world. So once I enable this, you'll see my whole world gets a little bit darker, which is normal. At the moment, this is more realistic. You can see that exposure's gone down a little bit. I'm going to click my directional light and change it to rotation at the top here. Or you could press W, E and R and Q to select each axis, each of these options at the top: move, translate and rotation and scale. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to quickly just rotate our sun up into the sky. The glitching on the clouds just then is not a bug, it's because my tool is snapping. So if I change my rotation and turn the tool off here, you'll see that it's more of a clean movement going on. There. Okay, I'll turn that back on before I forget. And what I need to do now is come into my directional light. At the top here, just click on it and you'll see the intensity is set to 10 lux. For a more realistic look, you want to be setting that to around 21, if not a bit higher. And this is more of a realistic, real life look to it now with minimal exposure. So that's that sorted. I've got world data layers and my world partition minimap. These are the settings for this, what we opened up a little bit earlier. Our world data layers are essentially the settings for our, if I come to Windows, world partition, you have data layer outliners. I'll showcase them in a future video when we start to add assets to our environment. That's essentially what world data layers are going to do. But I'm going to highlight that and highlight world partition minimap. Click the plus icon and I'm going to call this world partition, like so. And now that's set up, I'm going to come up and click the plus icon as well and go landscape. Just have a landscape folder, and this world partition folder is going to sit within that landscape folder, just like that. And now we're all organised a bit up there. We're going to move over now and go to our landscape selection tool. I'm going to give you an explanation of what this is. This is intended for beginners to intermediates. If you have experience in this, there'll be a timeline where you can skip through past this section. So we're going to hit the drop down menu, go to landscape, and you'll see now that we've got our landscape visible. This isn't a visible landscape or geometry if you like. This is essentially just a template of what our landscape will look like. At the top here we have create new, we have manage here, sculpt and paint. So sculpt are all the sculpting tools. You can see we've got no landscape. Paint tools is when you come to paint your landscape through the material. These I will showcase a little bit later on in the series, but for now we just need the manage tab. We've got some grayed out options here. That's simply because we haven't got a landscape rendered in the scene yet. Below that we have create new and import from file. I do have a previous series called Build Worlds V1 in which we use Gaia to export a height map and then import it through this means here. If you're interested in using Gaia and height maps and all that good stuff, then check it out right here. But for now we're just going to use create new. So below that we have enable edit layers. Enable edit layers is similar to Photoshop or Paint.net or anything outsourced that uses layers. So in Photoshop you can add an image to it and then create new layers on top. That's essentially what enable edit layers is. I can add layers. If I want to sculpt this landscape, which I will be doing, we're going to be sculpting it and using alpha brushes to design this landscape. When I come to do that, I will add a new layer to this landscape and start sculpting. And then if I want to use a landmass plugin, I will create a new layer for that, and the water body volumes, I will create a new layer for that. But that will be showcased throughout the series as we progress through. So make sure you have enable edit layers. It's very important generally when creating a new landscape that this should be enabled anyway. As you can see in 5.1, if I unselect it, it's not default. They have defaulted it now to enable edit layers. but in older versions of Unreal Engine you had to actually enable this. Okay, so below that we have world partition grid size. I'm going to come back to that, guys, because I want to actually get the actual size of the landscape of I want to actually set the size of my landscape before we start talking about world partition grid size. Below that we have a material slot. This, if you are just creating the landscape and you just want to know about world partition sizes and how world partition works, and you're in the right video, but I'm not going to assign a landscape material here, but here you can do if you want. We're going to be building the landscape material up from the ground in this series, so we're not going to apply anything there just yet. Below that you have your location, rotation and scale. That's just the size and rotation and all that good stuff. Just leave them at defaults, we don't really need them. Below this you have a section size, section per component, number of components, overall resolution. For this we need to relate to our technical guide, which is our landscape technical guide. The link for this will be in the description. It's very useful. For this series alone I'm going to be heading for a 4033 by 4033 landscape size. So I need to take into account these quads, which is 63, section size, which is 2 by 2, and the component size is 126 by 126 with an overall resolution here, which is 1K. This technical guide is very important if you're looking for a particular size. Keep in mind, guys, that the template you've seen for our landscape doesn't look big at the moment. Even though it's only set to an overall resolution of 505 by 505, this is still fairly big. So if I come here, this is pretty much how your first person character would look. If I move up, you can see it's still fairly large. There's games out there that are pretty popular that use smaller landscapes than this. I just want to reiterate about the size. Don't go off the template. The actual landscape will be bigger in comparison when you're actually in there playing a game or viewing around, if you like. So going back to our technical guide, I want 4033 by 4033, which has a quad section of 63. So as you can see, our section size is 63 quads by 63 quads, and what quads are the little green squares inside this complete section here. Essentially what quads are in a landscape are render targets for the engine. The engine will render out each of these squares, so the more squares you have, the harder the engine's going to have to work, so keep that in mind. Sections per component. Our sections per component there, you can see, is 4, so that's 2 by 2. At the moment it's set to 1 by 1, so I will need to change this by clicking the drop down menu to 2 sections by 2 sections, and now you can see I've got 2 sections per component. Underneath that you have a number of components, so let's go back to our technical guide. This is the number of components. So for 4033 by 4033 I need 126 by 126 of component size, which is essentially number of components. So if I click on that and go 126 tab 126 enter, and now you'll see our landscape has probably tripled in size, which is completely normal. Now as you can see I'm navigating this quite slowly because it's much larger now. What you could do is come to this camera speed at the top. Generally I set this to around a 5 or a 6. I'm going to go with 6, and then I can quickly move across the landscape so I can view it from multiple angles. Keep in mind you can actually change the speed within this 6 speed category, and if you hold right click on your mouse and WASD and navigate around the viewport, if you have a middle mouse button, which is a wheel or a middle wheel, let's just say if you have a wheel on your mouse in the middle, yeah, you can actually change the speed. So if I start moving across the landscape, I can speed this up and slow it down using that mouse wheel, but you still keep the category 6 speed, like so. And that's just one little tip that you would need to know if you're a beginner. So now we have got our actual size. You can see our overall resolution is 4033 by 4033 with a total components of 1024. Then this technical guide is served us fine. As you can see, we've got 104 and that's 32 by 32 components, which is fine. Now I want to head back to the world partition grid size. As you can see, the world partition grid size looks a little bit smaller than it did at the start, and that is just because of the sheer size of the landscape. So for this kind of size, which is 4033 by 4033, I'm going to want to increase this. The more world partition grid sizes you have, the harder the engine has to work. So let's just go into world partition now. With world partition, what essentially it's going to do is it's going to break your landscape up into sections, and it will enable the engine to stream them as streaming proxies. And then streaming proxies are going to load in and unload depending on the range of the streaming source. Now, in most cases, if you start a new project, you're going to be using first person or third person or something like that. I don't think world partition is supported in like VR and things like that just yet. But in general, the streaming source is going to be your first person or third person character. You can set up assets that are going to be streaming sources. Now, streaming sources can be quite important when creating large open world games. They can be quite important, but I'm not going to talk about them much in this video because it is very advanced for streaming sources and level streaming and things like that. So things like that will come at a later date, maybe on this channel. But essentially, each section of this grid size, each grid, if you like, each yellow box you see in here, will be a streamed landscape section. And say I'm over here with my player and I'm working here or playing here, then the opposite side of our landscape will not be streamed in. This is very powerful as it helps with performance for games and performance when creating a game. World partition is very important, and essentially that's what world partition is. When you create your landscape, it's going to break it up into sections that you're specifying here in your world partition grid size, and then you can unload and load them sections when working on the environment in this world partition window, or in general it will set a decent distance up for these streaming proxies or sections of landscape, and then if you're over here, this sections over here will not be loaded in, and this does massively increase performance on your workflow and when playing a game. So that's essentially in a nutshell what world partition is. It's just a landscape that is broken up into sections, and then the engine or your game will stream them sections in, which will increase performance. Okay, so like I said, I want to increase this. Having this many sections in such a large map is not advisable. The more sections you have, the more hard work your engine has to do. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to set this to around a 6, like so. Well, I might change my mind actually. As you can see, we're getting large sections here on the edge in this corner, but on here we're getting 2 bars at the end, and them 2 bars are essentially coming from this. As you can see there, these sections on the width are larger than these sections. No, they're not, they're the same size. But these 2 on the edge, we don't want these. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to increase this one more. And we're still getting the weird shaped landscape. So I'm going to increase it one more to 8. And now there we go, we've matched up our world partition grid size. And that is more manageable, I believe. The last thing you want is looking in the distance and seeing little squares popping in and out. That's one thing that happens with smaller grid sizes on world partition. But as you can see here, this is exactly how I want it, the correct size, the correct number of world partition grids. It's going to be more manageable and easier to work with. and create a lot more better performance. What I need to do now, guys, is just click the create button. If you hit the fill world button, then this landscape is just going to fill your world, and good luck to your machine if you do that. Once I hit create, this could take up to a minute, maybe up to 2 minutes to create the landscape, depending on the power in your machine. Now I've got a fairly powerful machine, so this will still take me around a minute to build. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hit create. One thing I will state to you guys is if it does not look like it's doing anything, do not close the program. Don't alt control and delete and start closing the engine down. Even if it's taking 10 minutes, just leave it to build. It will be building in the background. Once Unreal Engine crashes, it closes it down automatically and gives you a little splash screen saying here's what's happened. So whatever you do, guys, if you've got a slow machine, don't be alarmed. Just hit create and give it time to build the landscape, because the engine is building a lot of geometry here. Okay guys, as you can see, my landscape has been made. I'm just going to set these back to default. These are the sculpting tool parameters. As you can see, my landscape is now built. What I need you to do before, if it asks you to autosave or anything like that, don't autosave. Don't let it autosave, it will mess it up. What I need you to do now is just open your World Partition tab, what we opened up a little bit earlier on in the video. And you should have it looking the same as mine, like this, where it's just completely empty and it looks like it's not working. By now, what we need to do, if you follow these steps that I'm going to take, then your World Partition landscape should be set up just correctly how we need it for the rest of the series. Or if you're just following along in this video, follow these simple steps just to guarantee that the World Partition is working properly. There is some bugs with it, but I have worked out how to set it up properly, even though, keep in mind, it may still not work. If it doesn't work for you, then you may have to go into the documentation, which is here, and look for World Partition. The link will be in the description. I am kind of hoping it doesn't work correctly for me, just so I can showcase what the problem is. So essentially, we need to come out of landscaping mode, hit select, and what we would need to do is just hit save. And we're going to save our project now. And as you can see, we've saved our project, but nothing has appeared in the World Partition view here, which is not right, but it's just one of them things with World Partition. We are going to sort this out. If it has appeared for you here, then you're fine. It's completely fine. Just keep watching the video just to make sure it's there, but don't start trying to unload and load different things within your World Partition view here. Just try and follow these steps as much as you can. So now we've saved it, what we need to do is go up to File, New Level, and we're just going to create the basic level, and then we're just going to hit Create, like so. And just let your new level create. Oh god, my camera speed's still fast from before. Let's slow this down a bit. I'm going to come here, Control and 1 to set a bookmark, and hit 1, it'll move me back. Okay, so now we've done that, I'm going to come to File again, and then Save Current Level. You can see here, I've already got multiple levels here, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to overwrite this reset map. If you haven't got multiple levels, you should have one level or how many other levels, but what you want is a reset map. So that's why I've called this is just reset map. So I'm going to hit save and then yes. And now we've got our reset map. What we need to do is just come to File, Recent Levels, and open up the map that we've just been working in to create that landscape. We'll do this. And now you should see that the landscape is missing, and we've got all these landscaping streaming proxies here. Now, if I look in here, you'll see all these streaming proxies are there. We're going to move that into the landscape folder shortly. What we can do here is drag over all of them. So the white box is highlighted all these squares. We're going to right click, load region from selection. And this should load our landscape. And there you go. Now, for the people who are struggling with this particular moment. If you're not seeing it like this, and say I unload the selected regions now, like so, and you're seeing this like this, but are still seeing your landscape even though you highlight all. If you're seeing your landscape and it's like this and you can right click and load from selection, that means this has not worked for you, and unfortunately you are going to have to come into your landscape, click on each, or just click the top one and then come to the bottom, left shift and click and delete all your streaming proxies, and then delete the landscape itself, save it, and then repeat the process that we've just done. That is the downside to World Partition. It's not any way that I've done it personally in this video, it's just the bugs within World Partition. So just to get it correct, you would have to delete all your landscape. Don't just right click here and edit and delete, it shouldn't allow you to anyway. You would have to open it and then delete all the proxies inside and then delete that landscape. And that way you can follow along with what we've just done over the course of this video, and then it should work if you keep trying at it. And make sure, guys, if before you delete all these, that you drag over these, and if you can right click and unload selection, do that, save it, then delete it, and repeat the steps that we've just done, and it should work. Okay, so for the guys who it has worked from, we're going to right click over all of these and load selection from region, and now essentially World Partition is now enabled within your scene. That's normal how it loads, don't worry. And like I say, what World Partition is a streaming proxy. So if I come here, I'm going to come to landscaping mode. You don't have to follow along with this, I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes. I'm going to increase that, and I'm just going to build up some here. Some of that's ridiculous, like so. Okay, and then I'm going to come out of landscaping mode, selection mode, and you can see I've got this weird looking thing here. What I'm going to do now is just showcase it working, how World Partition works. So what we need to do with how, like I say earlier on, essentially World Partition is going to stream in these landscapes. So for me, if I come here now and just right click here and play from here, pardon me, now you can see the absolute scale of this landscape. If I look over there, it doesn't look any different. If you keep your eye to the bottom right on the World Partition, you'll see it's all highlighted in orange. That means we're in play mode. And you can see that little orange thing to the top right of the window that's rotating. That's our player. Now, if I look at these little mountains we just made and start moving backwards, you'll see that we're moving incredibly slow. So what I want to do, guys, if you're using the first person blueprint or third person blueprint and it was working extremely slow, come to your content drawer at the bottom. I'm using the first person template with World Partition enabled already. I'm going to go to blueprints, first person character, yours might be third person. Double click that and open the blueprint up. This is a blueprint within Unreal Engine. I will be showcasing blueprints at some point on this channel, but I'm more of an environmental artist and level designer. Blueprints will become extremely useful when doing level design, so I'll be showcasing blueprints then. But what we're going to look for is our character movement, and at the right hand side of on our details panel, we're going to look for character movement walking, and then we're going to look for max walk speed. At the minute it's set to 600 centimeters per second. I'm just going to add a 0 in there and have 6,000 centimeters per second. I'm going to come to the top left and compile and save and close our blueprint character off. What I want to do now is right click and play from here, and now our character is going to move a lot faster. Keep in mind that we're at runtime here now, so if I start moving backwards you can see how fast our character is moving now. And once I get out of this section should start despawning like so. You see how that mountain range is spawning in? If you look over there, you can can see it's starting to spawn in. I move a bit closer and it'll spawn the rest in. And that essentially is a demonstration of what world partition is at runtime. It just streams in the sections of the landscape when your streaming source, which is our player character, is at a close angle. So if I come back off there now, come out of play mode, what I want to do now is showcase what world partition is going to do to help us when creating an environment. So if I right click here and unload selected regions, you can see there now that I've still got them two there, which is normal, and you can see I've unloaded the whole landscape. The reason these have not disappeared when I've unloaded the whole landscape is because I've not saved it. As you can see, I've got two unsaved at the bottom right here, and you can see I've got two landscape streaming boxes that have not been saved, and that's why they won't unload. Now, to solve this, we need to load our entire landscape back up again. Like so, and then go to your two saved, click on it, and then just put saved selected, and then it's gonna save them land streaming proxies. Now I can right click and unload selected regions, and you'll see the whole landscape has disappeared. Now the demonstration into why this is important for game development or environmental art and level design and all that good stuff is because I can come to here and just load these four sections. Load sections, and you'll see it'll load them sections of the landscape. Now I can unload them as well and come to this section and right click and load them sections as well, and that'll load these. And this is the power of world partition. You can come in here and edit all this. You'll see it more in my next video where I start to sculpt and design our environment to the best of my ability anyway. And you'll see this more in action, because I can come in here and start sculpting and creating mountains and start editing all this up to what I need, and I don't have the engine having to render in all the other bits of landscape that I have to edit, that I'm not editing. And that is the essential power of world partition and when creating games and environments and things like that. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, what world partition is. Now you'll notice that I unloaded that little selection first. It's very important, if you have a section open like this, load selection from region, do not drag over all of it with that selected and right click and load region from selected. It's very important that, because it can confuse that streaming proxy. It's very important to get in a habit of right click, unload selection regions, and then load the rest of the landscape like so. So that is basically it for world partition. You can see now we've got our landscape in here. What I'm going to do, because I don't like this, I'm just going to flatten this out. I'm going to come to landscape mode. I'm in my sculpt tool. I'm going to flatten. I'm just going to flatten all this out so we're back to a fresh landscape. Don't worry about that lagging. That's completely normal. So I'm just going to flatten all this out. Get a bit closer. As you can see, it's a bit stuttery. That is because of the sheer size of the landscape, and because I'm still rendering all that landscape in. The slowness of this is completely normal. If you're using landscaping tools to sculpt and you're getting all this jaggy, laggy stuff, that is completely normal. Don't be alarmed. Don't think your engine's broke. Don't think your machine's not good enough. Even with an extremely powerful machine, Unreal Engine's landscaping mode still lags. It always lags because you're actually changing geometry. The engine itself is rendering this out in runtime while you're editing it. So you think, if I change this from lit to wireframe, all this wireframe here, the engine's rendering all that out, all them little squares. So when you start making changes, the engine in runtime is rendering them targets out. So don't be alarmed when making changes and it's like jagging it about like this. That's completely normal. So what I'm going to do here now, I'm going to unload selected regions because so it's not letting me unload this, just like I indicated before. So I'm going to drag over all of them, load selected regions. Remember what we did before. Let the rest of the landscape load, like so, and then hit for unsaved, click selected, select whatever, just save it, and then if I right click on unload selected, and there we go. Okay, so that essentially is how world partition works. So now we can stream in and out of our landscape in runtime, and we can also enable and disable sections of our landscape and when we are editing or playing our games. There's a couple of things I want to go over before I wrap up this tutorial. If we come to world settings, if you've not seen it, go to window, world settings here, and then you have a world partition setup. Enable streaming is quite important. This will already be enabled if you are using the open world template. If not, and you've not enabled it and you've got this far in the tutorial, then you've got a supercomputer. I should have stated this really at the beginning, but don't worry about it. It should be enabled by default, to be honest, even when not using it. But to be fair, if you've not enabled world partition within your project settings and you're not using the world partition template or open world template, then this world partition tab will not be here. Below that we have runtime grid settings. Your grid, essentially what this is, when you apply an object like a tree, a rock or anything to your object, so you're building in your world, that would be automatically assigned to your main grid. Now, I'm not going to go through these runtime grid settings right now because I want to go through this when I'm actually populating my scene, and at that point we will start using runtime grids. But the concept of runtime grids is similar to loading in and loading out your streaming proxies for the landscape. The further away from that particular proxy you are, then it's not loaded in. It's a similar thing with these grids, but it's more used for props like chairs and trees and rocks and all that good stuff. So I could change this from main grid and say rocks, and then I could come up here to this array, add an element in there and change the name of that grid. So at the minute we have index 0, and if we add another one, it'll then become index 1, index 2, so on and so on. And I could change all these names, and you could change the cell size, loading range at which these objects will load in, and all that good stuff. That's just a brief explanation of how these work. But like I say, once we've got to a certain stage at which we are applying trees to our landscape and applying rocks and foliage and all that good stuff, then runtime grids will come into play. One thing I will show is if I was to come in here now, let me load up a section of my landscape. So load region from selected. I'll come over here and say I come to my content drawer. It's content. I'm just going to use the epic chair. I'll drag this chair in. I could make it big and demonstrate how runtime grids work, but I'm not going to in this tutorial because I feel it's long enough as it is. But with this particular prop selected, I can come to the details panel, and it's already open because I was looking at it before. But you see, in this particular object, we've got a world partition section. This will become enabled once you enable world partition or start with the open world template. And with world partition, you've got a runtime grid. Going back to world settings, world partition, you've got runtime settings, and this is your grids. So runtime grids. And now with this main grid, I could control and C on there, go to the details panel, in your runtime grid, I could highlight that and put main grid in there. So this object, this chair we've got here in our scene, will work off the distance of that runtime grid. So yeah, I'm just going to delete that chair. Okay, so at the minute, I'm going to come to my world partition, right click on unload selected regions because nothing has changed. So no new changes to save. And at the minute, guys, that is essentially how you would set up a landscape with world partition ready to rock. on the for the rest of the series. So that has come to an end of this tutorial. If you found this tutorial useful and you've learned a bit about landscapes and how world partition is going to work throughout the series and in your projects in particular, then leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're interested in environmental art, level design and shader creation, as I do have experience in all that, and I will see you in the next video, guys. Thank you, bye.